My name is Chris Yee and I'm making a 3D puzzle platformer called Nectar. In the game, you play as a potted sunflower with his bumblebee companion, using globs of nectar to grow plants and manipulate the world. In this video, I'm going to talk about the one decision I made that's guaranteed to expand the audience for Nectar. But first, let's start at the beginning. I was working on the game for about 7 months and I was making decent progress, but there was one thing that bothered me for that entire time. I had no main menu. I knew that I wanted to work towards a demo that I could give to players to playtest, but one key component that I need for that is a main menu. So I finally decided it was time. I began to set up the main menu with just the bare minimum. I started with a play button and a quit button, and those were pretty easy to set up. But I was still missing something important: settings. But what settings should I include? I knew that I should have some audio settings, so some control over the volume of the music, the sound effects, the ambient noise. I also knew I wanted video settings, just to adjust all of the standard stuff like resolution, graphics settings, windowed mode. And then for gameplay settings, I knew I wanted to have the option for inverted controls, and I wanted to be able to adjust the sensitivity of the camera movement. And that's when I started to think, those last two things, the inverted controls and the sensitivity, are really accessibility options. The inverted controls makes it easier for people that are used to inverted controls to play the game, otherwise they wouldn't be able to. And sensitivity controls are the same way. Having more sensitivity or less sensitivity makes it easier for certain players to play the game. And that got me thinking about more accessibility options. Now when you think about accessibility and video games, the first things that come to my mind are subtitles and maybe a colorblind mode. But there are a lot of things that contribute to accessibility that you wouldn't normally think of as accessibility options, like the inverted controls or the sensitivity. And adding accessibility options is really a win-win proposition. The player has more options to customize the game to meet their needs and preferences, so it's good for them. But it's also good for the developer because more options means that more people can play the game, which means that you have a larger audience. And that can translate directly into sales. So considering accessibility really is a no-brainer. Some might say that's a little too early in the development of Nectar to start thinking about these things, but I don't want accessibility to be an afterthought, and I want to be conscious of these things while I'm designing the game. It's also just easier to implement things if I set them up correctly early on. So I started to do research on how me as a solo dev could add accessibility options to my game with the limited resources that I have. And some of the resources that I used are a GMTK series about accessibility where each video he covers a certain aspect of accessibility, whether it's visual, audio, cognitive, or input. I looked at the Abled Gamers website as a resource. And then Unreal actually had a video demonstration showing off some of their accessibility options that are built into the engine. Now if any of you want to check these out and try to implement these into your game, I'll leave a link in the description to these resources. Now, I knew that I wouldn't be able to compete with AAA studios like Naughty Dog and Insomniac in how they implement accessibility options, but there are some very simple ways that require very little work on my end to get into the game in the first place. And I want to share some of these things so that if you want to include them in your game, you can as well. Now, I've already mentioned the inverted controls. That was easy enough to implement. So in my player controller blueprint, where I have input values for the camera control, I just put a branch, and if the player checks off inverted, it multiplies the input value by -1, and that inverts the controls, and that's easy enough. For sensitivity, it's a similar thing, where the camera control input comes into the player controller. If the player changes the sensitivity, I multiply the input value by a certain factor, depending on what they choose. Another thing that I've added is adjusting the field of view, so the player has control over the field of view, and that's as easy as just getting the camera settings and changing the field of view if the player changes the slider. Now the next one is an interesting one. It's the auto camera. In one of my previous devlogs, I actually covered a partial auto camera for controller input. So in that case, if you're using a controller, the camera sort of auto assists a little bit, and it kind of helps the camera stay behind the player even if they're not controlling the camera at all. that's on without this option being on, but if you switch this option on, it ramps up that feature into full effect. So when you turn, the camera will always stay behind you. That way, players that have trouble controlling the camera don't really need to worry about that. It'll just always stay behind the character, for both controller and keyboard and mouse. Now for colorblind options, Unreal actually does have some colorblind filters built into the engine. There's a node that can simulate how people with different types of colorblindness see the game, and then that same node has an option to correct that type of colorblindness. And that's just an overall filter for the full image. It kind of shifts the colors into a spectrum that's more suitable for some people. But I know that there have been some criticisms on those full screen filters. Sometimes they're not as effective as they could be. So I wanted to give a little more flexibility with colorblind options. And that's why I added a color override system. So if the filters don't work for you, then you can customize the colors for very specific things and make them the exact color that works for you. Right now I only have the option to change the color of the player, the bee, grass, and nectar, but I do plan on adding more things that you can change colors. I really just wanted to get the framework in there, and then eventually I can add more and more things to it. So that's color blindness. Next I have the option to toggle a button instead of holding a button. So right now to activate the player nectar that comes from the character, you have to hold the button and it activates, and then it deactivates when you let go of the button. But some people struggle to hold buttons down. So I wanted to add the option to toggle instead of holding. So if you have this checked, then you can press the button and the nectar will activate and stay activated, even when you let go. And then the next time you press the button, it will deactivate. Now a cool option that I added to the game that's actually very, very easy to add is the ability to slow down the game. There is a time dilation node, and if you change the value on that time dilation node, you can either make the game slower or make the game faster. And it literally just slows down the tick or speeds up the tick. But the ability to slow down the game makes it so that players that are struggling in certain areas can slow it down, and then they can more easily time things or process things. It just makes it easier in general. Now, I don't know why you'd want to speed up the game, but I put in the option anyway. Maybe speedrunners will use it, I don't know. Now, I haven't addressed the two most requested accessibility features in most games. The first one is subtitles, but my game has no dialogue, so there's no need for subtitles. Which leaves me with the second one, which is the ability to fully remap the controls. Now, all or most of the previous settings that I've added for accessibility have been fairly easy to implement. This remappable control thing was not easy, it wasn't simple at all. I spent maybe a couple weeks just trying to get this remappable thing to work, but I did eventually get it to work, and now it works, and it allows players to choose exactly what button they want to hit or key on the keyboard they want to hit to do things. It lets them choose if they want to use the mouse or not, if they want to use the thumbsticks or not, and I have it set up so that it prevents you from putting in repeated buttons, so you can't have one button that does everything. That wouldn't make sense and it wouldn't work, so I prevent people from doing that. I'm not going to go too in depth into how I got it to work, just because it was pretty complicated and that would be a whole video on its own. But there are tutorials out there, and if there is enough demand, maybe I'll do something similar to what I did with the tightrope that I made. It wouldn't be a full tutorial, but it would be more of a blueprint breakdown, just showing my blueprint in greater depth. And those are all the accessibility options I have in my game so far. I have thought about maybe adding icons over objects of interest to help players find things. I haven't decided if I want to do that or not, but maybe. And if you have any other ideas for accessibility options I can add into the game, put them in the comments. There's no guarantee that I'll be able to implement it just because I am a solo dev and my resources are limited, but if it is a good enough idea and I think I'm able to do it, then I'll try to get it into the game. But what do you think? Do you think these accessibility options are worth it? What features have you put into your game for accessibility? What are some other games that have good examples of accessibility options? If you have examples, put them in the comments. It's always good to highlight this type of thing. So now I have a menu, I have accessibility options, and now I can get back to working on the game itself. rather than a menu, which I am very much looking forward to. If you want to support the game, I have a Steam page and you can wishlist the game. Links in the description. If you want to join the community, I have a Discord server. That's usually the best place for you to ask questions if you have technical questions that I might be able to help with. And if you want to see more videos in the future, subscribe to this channel. Thanks!